Share my bed or die in the cold. The Apache woman's words cut through the wind like a blade aimed at the lonely cowboy's heart. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It was the winter of 1881, deep in December, when the Wyoming plains disappeared beneath weeks of blizzard and silence. The land had turned to shades of gray and white, the rocks half buried under heavy snow. The winters had grown crueler with each passing year, or maybe that was just how Matthew Cole felt them now. 36, worn thin by grief. Once he had been a husband and a father, but fever had taken his wife, and a few days later, their little boy. That was 3 winters past. Since then, his days had been stripped down to the bare bones of survival, keeping the roof standing, the horses alive, and the fire burning just long enough to see another sunrise. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He stayed away from towns because towns meant questions and he had no answers left to give. Solitude was easier than memory. His cabin stood half a mile off the main trail, a single room built from pine he'd cut with his own hands, low ceiling, a rough plank bed, a table and 2 chairs, and a stove that held the only warmth left in his world. It wasn't a home, just a place to endure. His only goal, outlast the winter, keep the stove alive, feed the horses, and pray that loneliness didn't carve away what little spirit remained. The night the knock came, the storm had already been rising since dusk. Wind pressed hard against the walls, rattling the shutters, shaking the latch as if testing his defenses. Snow swept sideways across the windows, sneaking through the cracks no matter how many times he patched them. He sat at the table under a dim lantern, mending a leather strap with needle and thread. His rifle leaned beside him, a habit as natural as breathing. The fire cracked in the stove, the only sound in the room. At first, he thought he'd imagined it. A faint thump against the door, swallowed by the howl outside. He froze needle midair. Then it came again, sharper, desperate. His chest tightened. No one came this far without cause, and cause was rarely kind. He took the rifle in hand and moved quietly to the door, listening. For a moment, only the storm answered. Then 3 more knocks, uneven, weaker. He drew the latch and pulled the door open, rifle low but ready. A woman stood there, nearly buried in snow. The wind drove her forward as if the storm itself wanted her inside. Her long black hair clung to her face in frozen strands, her bronze skin pale beneath the frost. Cracked lips, trembling hands, and eyes, dark, fierce, unbroken, locked straight on him. Her deerskin dress was torn at the seams and stiff with ice clinging to her form. The cold had stripped it of modesty, not intent. Her voice came rough, scraped raw by the wind. Share my bed or freeze. For a heartbeat, instinct told him to close the door. He had made promises to let no one in, to keep to his silence. He had sworn off hope, off company, off the pain that came with either. But as he looked at her shaking shoulders, the red of her fingers curling tight against her sides, he knew the truth. If he sent her away, she wouldn't see dawn. He lowered the rifle and stepped aside without a word. She crossed the threshold quickly, as if afraid he'd change his mind. The warmth from the stove hit her and she gasped softly, eyes closing for a moment before meeting his again. Snow slipped from her hair to the floor. She held herself tightly, the damp deerskin clinging close, her gaze sharp but cautious, like someone who had been told to beg but chose instead to command. Matthew shut the door, set the rifle aside, and studied her by the flickering lantern light. Young, maybe 24. Apache by her bearing and the beadwork on her torn dress. Trouble if others were hunting her. But she stood alone. He pulled a blanket from his bed and laid it beside the stove. She sank down slowly, drawing it around her shoulders, but her eyes never left his. He turned back to the stove, filled a tin bowl with thin stew, and placed it before her without a sound. She hesitated only a heartbeat before lifting it with both hands and drinking. Her eyes softened just slightly, but he caught the faint release in her shoulders as the warmth took hold. Matthew leaned against the table, arms crossed, studying her as she ate. His thoughts moved faster than his calm face showed. Who was she? What had driven her here? Was someone chasing her through the storm? The questions circled with no answers, only the uneasy sense that fate had pushed her to his door, giving him no time or choice to refuse. That pressure in his chest returned, not fear this time, but something older, heavier. The ghost of responsibility. The wind struck the cabin again, making it shudder under the weight of snow. He fed more wood to the stove. When he turned back, she was standing. The blanket clung to her shoulders, and she moved toward his bed without asking. She pulled the covers aside and slid beneath them, eyes fixed on him, steady and unreadable. She left a space beside her, a silent invitation that carried no shame, only certainty. Matthew stood frozen, breath tight. His thoughts tangled between the past and the present. He remembered his wife in that same bed, their laughter before the sickness took it all. He remembered holding his boy until the small body grew cold. His hand trembled on the chair. He wanted to turn away, keep his promise to solitude, but outside the storm raged with no mercy. The woman lay half lit by lantern glow, her features a mix of defiance and fear. He moved at last, slow and careful, boots still on, sitting at the edge of the bed. She inched closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. Her warmth bled through his clothes, her breathing soft and even. Neither spoke. The fire crackled low and the storm filled the silence. Matthew stared at the ceiling, torn between dread of what this might mean and the simple truth that she lived because he had opened the door. For now that was enough. For the first time in 3 years, the cabin wasn't empty. The storm clawed through the night, shaking beams and hammering snow against the shutters until even the lantern's light seemed swallowed. Inside, the air grew thick with heat and smoke, the damp scent of her drying clothes mingling with pine. Matthew lay rigid on one side of the bed, boots still on, his back half turned. He could feel her warmth through the thin blankets. Each time she moved, his body tensed. The bed felt like a grave of old memories, his wife's laughter, the weight of loss, and he fought to keep still, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. Her breath brushed his shoulder, steady and alive. It had been years since another soul had shared his silence. Part of him wanted to pull away, but another, smaller, stubborn, told him to let her stay. She had come half frozen. Had he turned her out, she'd be buried by dawn. That truth kept him still. The night stretched long and sleepless. He caught flashes he wished he hadn't. The way her hair dried across the blanket, her shoulders trembling, the torn edge of her dress that offered little warmth. He turned his gaze away, ashamed of the thoughts that flickered through him, though they were only proof he was still human. Sleep came fitful and shallow. When morning finally broke, the world outside lay buried in white silence. The wind had died, leaving a hush so deep it felt sacred. Matthew rose first, pulled on his coat, lit the lamp, and fed the stove. He looked to the bed. She was awake, watching him, her face no longer gray with cold. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her lips no longer cracked. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "I need your name," Matthew said, his voice low but steady. She paused, weighing whether to trust him. "Nia," she said at last. The name carried strength even through the rasp of her throat. "You come from a nearby band?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, my people scattered, some dead, some taken." Her hands tightened on the blanket. "I walked many days. Men followed. I lost them in the storm." The answers filled the gaps that had haunted him through the night. Why she had come, why her eyes carried both fire and exhaustion. She hadn't stumbled here by accident. She had been hunted and the storm had driven her to him. Matthew poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of her. She reached out slowly, eyes locked on his as though expecting him to pull it back. He didn't. She drank, winced at the heat, then relaxed just a little. "You can stay until the storm breaks," Matthew said finally. The words felt heavier than they should have, because in them lay a choice he hadn't planned to make. Letting her in meant breaking the rhythm that had kept him alive for 3 winters. It meant facing the things he'd buried. Questions lingered in Matthew's mind, whether he was still capable of caring for another soul. Across the room, Nia watched him with those dark, unblinking eyes. "I stay until I can walk without freezing," she said, not pleading, not thanking, simply stating it as truth. Matthew felt something stir at her tone. He recognized it, the same stubbornness that had once kept him alive. He respected it, even as it unsettled him. He lifted the pot from the stove and poured another helping of stew into her bowl. This time she ate slower, not with the desperation of the night before. While she ate, he studied her clothing. The dress was torn, paper thin against the bite of Wyoming's winter. If she stepped outside again in that, she wouldn't last an hour. He walked to the small chest near the bed, took out a wool shirt far too large for her, and laid it on the table. "You'll need this," he said. Her eyes flicked from the shirt to him, pride and need warred in her face. After a moment, she reached for it. Her fingers brushed the rough fabric, tracing the weave as though the simple act cost her something. She didn't put it on yet, but he saw her hands tighten around it. The day passed mostly in silence, broken by the rhythm of chores. Matthew shoveled snow from the door, checked the horses in the lean-to, split wood until his shoulders burned. Each time he came inside, she was there, by the fire, sometimes watching him, sometimes staring into the flames with a faraway look that told of loss she didn't voice. He didn't ask. He knew the weight of silence and the mercy of keeping it. By evening, the wind had softened, letting the creak of trees rise outside. Matthew sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. Nia stood, blanket drawn close, and came to him. Without a word, she lifted the wool shirt he'd given her earlier and pulled it over her torn dress. It hung loose but covered her shoulders at last. Then she sat across from him, her hands resting flat on the wood. "You lost someone too," she said quietly. His hands froze on the rifle. The words hit like a blow. Anger flared, not at her, but at what she'd touched. He saw flashes, his wife's fevered breath, his son's hand going limp in his. He hadn't spoken of them to anyone since that winter. His jaw tightened before he forced himself to answer. Yes. Nothing more. Nia didn't press. She only nodded as though that one word was enough. The fire burned low and the night wrapped around them. When they lay down again, Matthew removed his boots this time. He settled beside her slowly, aware of her warmth when she shifted closer. He didn't reach for her, not yet, but her nearness eased the emptiness that had haunted him too long. He stared up at the beams, listening to the hush between them, and felt something shift. The cabin no longer belonged to solitude alone. Morning came with a pale silver sun struggling behind clouds. The plains were buried deep, drifts high against the cabin walls. Travel would be impossible for days. Matthew stood by the window, breath misting the glass as he studied the white expanse. Behind him, he heard the rustle of blankets. Nia sat up, her dark hair spilling loose over the wool shirt. She looked stronger than she had the night before, though her eyes still held the sharp alertness of someone who'd learned to survive by watching. The weight of responsibility pressed deeper in him now. It was no longer about keeping himself alive. She had said men had followed her. The storm wouldn't hide her forever. Questions rose again. Who were they? How many? And why had they driven her so far? He hadn't asked before, but now he knew he must. He turned from the window, pulled on his coat, and added more wood to the stove. "You'll tell me more," he said evenly. Nia's eyes met his, then dropped. "They were traders," she said at last. "Men who buy and sell. They wanted me for trade. I ran when I could." Her hands clenched in her lap. "If they find me, they won't stop." The air thickened between them. Matthew had heard stories like that before, and worse. Anger stirred low and heavy inside him, though his face stayed composed. He understood what it meant. If she had escaped, those men wouldn't forget. And if they found her here, they'd bring death to his door. He pushed the thought aside. He couldn't send her back into the snow. The choice had already been made the moment he let her in. He made breakfast, cornbread from the pan, and what stew remained. They ate without words, but the silence had changed. It wasn't emptiness now, it was shared, steady. Understanding, if not yet trust. Nia ate slowly, her eyes moving around the cabin, memorizing every corner. Her posture softened a little, though her shoulders stayed squared, ready. When they finished, Matthew stood to his chores again. The door had to be cleared of snow just to open. The horses needed water melted from ice. He worked with his old steady rhythm, but now more than once, he caught himself glancing back toward the cabin, half expecting her to be gone, half fearing she was still too weak to manage on her own. Matthew stepped back inside. He stopped short when he saw her near the fire, the needle and thread he'd left lying on the table now in her hands. She was mending the sleeve of his old shirt, stitching carefully, her brow drawn tight in focus. The sight caught him off guard. No one had touched his clothes since his wife. The simple act struck deeper than he wanted to feel, yet he couldn't turn away. Nia noticed his gaze, paused, then offered the shirt back with a small nod. "Better now," she said softly. He took it without replying, though his throat had turned dry. He wanted to ask about her, if she still had kin, what she'd do when the thaw came, but he held the words in. For now, she was here, and that was enough. By evening, the cabin filled with warmth from the fire. Nia moved close to the stove. her hair glinting in the amber light, her figure traced in shadow and flame. Matthew sat at the table, his hands heavy on the wood, thoughts looping tight. If townsfolk ever saw her, questions would follow, and questions turned cruel quick when Apache blood was involved. Bringing her there would only trade one danger for another. Here at least the walls gave shelter, though they also bound him to her fate. She broke the quiet first. "You didn't ask why I knocked." Matthew looked up, surprised. "I chose this door," she said, eyes steady. "Not just because of the storm. I saw smoke. I thought maybe the man inside still had a heart." Her voice was low but firm. "If I was wrong, I'd have died on your step." The words hit something buried deep. For 3 winters he had lived untouched by need, keeping every soul at a distance. But now, sitting across from her, he felt the wall he'd built beginning to crack. His jaw tightened. His hands closed around the edge of the table. That night, when they lay again in the bed, the silence between them was heavier, but no longer empty. Nia moved closer, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. Matthew stiffened, then let the moment stand. He could feel her heartbeat through the nearness, steady and sure. For the first time in years, he didn't lie awake haunted by ghosts, but listening to another's breath beside him. Sleep came quietly, carrying the thought that tomorrow would bring questions neither could avoid, about the men hunting her, and what her presence meant. But tonight, survival was enough. 2 hearts, 1 fire, both still alive against the cold. After the storm, the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Matthew no longer moved only for himself. Each time he split wood, hauled water, or checked the horses, his thoughts drifted back to her. Nia had regained strength. Color returned to her skin, her voice no longer raw, her eyes bright and aware. She moved through his space with silent grace, mending, sweeping, rationing food with care. She seemed to understand how thin their stores ran. He saw her take less from the pot than she should, though he never mentioned it. What he couldn't ignore was her presence. For 3 winters, the cabin had breathed in silence. Now there were 2 sets of footsteps, 2 shadows, 2 steady heartbeats under one roof. He told himself it was temporary, that when the thaw came, she'd move on. But sometimes he caught her looking at the walls, the wood's glow, the patterns of light. It made him wonder if she imagined staying longer than either dared to say aloud. The quiet between them had changed. It no longer carried fear, but something steadier, almost comforting. When she brushed past him near the stove, when her hand met his reaching for a cup, when her hair fell forward in the firelight, each small moment jolted him. He fought not to stare at the soft line of her chest beneath the wool shirt he'd given her. Shame tangled with a strange kind of warmth, the pull of feeling alive again. One evening, as the storm outside eased for the first time in days, Matthew finally asked what had been pressing on his mind since she spoke of the men hunting her. "They'll keep looking," he said quietly. "How close are they?" Nia's eyes flicked toward the door. "Not far. They have horses. They don't quit easy." She drew the blanket tighter. "If they find me here, they'll try to take me. You too, if you stand in their way," the old instinct whispered. "Leave. Shut the door. Let trouble pass him by." But that choice was already gone. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then we'll be ready." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face. "Why, you don't know me." "You owe me nothing." Matthew's jaw flexed. "I owed my wife and boy, and I couldn't save them." His voice roughened. "I'm not turning another soul out to die. Not while I'm still breathing." The silence stretched, close but not cold. Nia lowered her eyes and reached across the table, resting her hand over his. The touch was light but heavy with meaning. He didn't pull away. The next morning, when Matthew stepped out to check the horses, he spotted tracks along the tree line, fresh, narrow, and circling. 1 horse, maybe 2. Not close, but too close. He returned inside, jaw tight, and Nia read the truth in his face before he spoke. "They've found the valley," he said. Her hand trembled around the cup. "Then it's only time," she said quietly. Matthew nodded, his mind already sharpening like steel on flint. He checked the rifle, laying out the few cartridges he still had. His hands moved with the ease of old habit. He hadn't fired in near a year, yet the motions came back smooth, practiced, and cold. Nia watched him in silence, though he could see the tightness in her chest, the shallow rhythm of her breath. She knew the men she had fled were close enough now for the wind to carry their scent. That night, unease hung between them, heavier than the storm outside. When they lay down, Matthew expected her to keep her distance as before. But instead she moved nearer, so near he could feel the heat of her body against his side, her head resting over his chest. His arm stiffened, uncertain, then settled around her, slow and unsure, like instinct had made the choice before his mind caught up. Her heartbeat pulsed steady against him, and in that quiet he realized she'd already stitched herself into the emptiness he'd sworn to keep. The cabin wasn't his alone anymore, and he knew it wouldn't stay untested. But as her breath deepened against him, Matthew made a decision he didn't voice. Whatever came, he wouldn't hand her over. Dawn broke brittle and white, the kind of cold that froze a man's lungs before the air left his mouth. Matthew cracked the cabin door just enough to look out. The world was locked in frost, snowdrifts high against the corral posts, the tree line silent and still. The tracks he'd seen yesterday had half filled with new snow, but they remained, shallow imprints not made by his horses. He lingered there longer than he should have, scanning the distance, rifle in hand, though he didn't raise it. Every instinct whispered that danger was near. When he shut the door again, Nia stood by the stove, blanket drawn tight, eyes fixed on him. She'd been watching, waiting for the truth written in his face. "They're close," he said at last. Her gaze dropped, lips tightening. "They won't stop," she murmured. "They think I belong to them." The words struck deep. Matthew sank into the chair, the rifle resting against his knee. He'd spent 3 winters promising never to bear another life's weight. Yet here she was, defiant, frightened, and unbroken. He remembered her first night, the command in her voice when she'd told him not to leave her outside. She hadn't begged since. She had refused to bend. That stirred something in him, respect and something sharper he dared not name. After a long silence, he spoke. "If they come here, they'll find this place hard. I know the land. I've stood ground before." Nia's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why risk it? You don't know me. You don't even know what I've done." Matthew met her gaze squarely. "I don't need to know," he said. "You came to my door. That makes it my fight." For the first time since he'd met her, she looked away, her shoulders easing as if the weight of his words unsettled her more than the threat outside. She turned to the stove, ladling stew neither of them had an appetite for. The day passed heavy and long. Matthew worked outside, clearing snow from the roof, feeding the horses, eyes sweeping every ridge for movement. Nia came out once, wrapped in his old shirt and a blanket, standing quiet at the corral's edge. She studied the valley, tracing the trails men might ride if they came. When Matthew noticed her gaze lingering toward the woods, he walked to her side. "You've seen them track before," he said. She nodded. "They're few but skilled. Storms don't stop them when they catch a scent." She paused, clutching the blanket closer. "They'll wait for dark." Matthew filed the warning away. She knew the hunter's minds better than he ever could. She wasn't a burden. She was a survivor fighting the same fight beside him. That truth deepened his respect. When night came, the fire burned low and shadows stretched long over the walls. They shared the bed again, the air thick with quiet. Nia shifted closer, her head fitting beneath his shoulder, her hand resting on his chest, lingering longer this time. His body tensed, then gave way. He hadn't felt a woman's touch in years. It rattled him more than the danger outside. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes in the dim glow. She didn't speak, but the nearness said enough. She trusted him with her life, with her fear. Sleep came late. Sometime past midnight, the horses snorted sharply in the lean-to. Matthew's eyes snapped open, every sense alive. He slipped from the bed, silent as breath, pulling on his coat, rifle already in hand. Nia rose too, silent and tense, her face drawn tight with knowing. The sound outside needed no explaining. Matthew opened the door just enough to slip through. The cold bit into him like a blade, but he ignored it, scanning the tree line. Movement flashed at the ridge, shadows shifting against snow. 3 men on horseback keeping their distance, watching. One lifted his arm, pointing toward the cabin. Matthew's gut turned solid. He stepped back in and shut the door. "They found us," he said, voice flat but edged with iron. Nia's breath caught, yet she straightened, her eyes calm, no trace of panic. "They'll come at dawn," she whispered. Matthew nodded once, sitting at the table, rifle resting across his knees. For years he had lived without care, without purpose, beyond routine. Now he saw with bitter clarity, he was no longer alone. And the fight coming wasn't just about surviving. It was about keeping her safe. As the fire dimmed, they waited side by side for dawn to bring danger to their door. Morning crept gray and cold, light leaking weak through the clouds. The cabin creaked in the freeze, every sound sharper, heavier. Matthew hadn't slept. He sat near the door, rifle balanced in his lap, gaze fixed on the rattling shutter. His body coiled tight beneath stillness. 3 men out there, maybe more, waiting for the right moment. Nia hadn't slept either. She sat near the stove, wrapped in her blanket, her dark eyes steady on him. She didn't ask his plan. Her silence said enough. She trusted him, though she hardly knew his name. The weight of that trust pressed harder than any fear. Questions he'd buried rose now with the morning light. Who were those men really? What did they want with her beyond trade? And why had she come alone that night? As if she felt his thoughts, Nia spoke, voice low, clear. They took others from my people, she said. Women, children, anyone they could sell. Some went to towns for work, others... She stopped, jaw tightening. I ran before they could take me too. They think I still belong. Matthew's jaw locked, his eyes narrowing. He knew men like that, traders who turned lives into coin. He'd seen them in border towns, and each time it stirred a deep, wordless rage. Now that anger was clean, immediate. They were coming for her. By mid-morning, the faint sound of hooves reached through the wind. Matthew rose slowly, peering through the shutter's crack. 3 riders dismounted at the clearing's edge, moving deliberate, scanning the cabin and corral. Rifles and pistols glinted beneath scarves drawn tight against the cold. One pointed toward the chimney smoke. They knew someone waited inside. Matthew stepped back, mind racing. He had the walls for cover, 1 rifle and a revolver with only a few rounds. He'd fought worse odds, but never with another life bound to his own. They'll try to draw me out, he said quietly. If I fall, you run. Take the ridge. Don't look back. Nia rose sharply, blanket sliding from her shoulders. No, I won't leave. You don't understand what they'll do if they catch you. Her voice hardened. I do, that's why I stay. If they take you, they take me anyway. Frustration flared, but then something shifted in him. She wasn't reckless, she was alive because she refused to bend. That same fire now steadied him. He gave a short nod. Then stay low. Keep clear of the windows. A voice called from outside, rough and commanding. Man inside, send the girl out and we'll let you live. Matthew's grip tightened on the rifle. He said nothing. He lifted the barrel through the crack and fired. The shot kicked snow beside the nearest rider's boots. The men shouted, scattering for cover. Their answer came fast. Gunfire tearing into the walls, splinters flying from the doorframe. Nia ducked beside the stove, hands over her head but eyes open, steady. Matthew moved low from one shutter to the next, firing in careful bursts, not to kill but to hold them off. Yet as minutes passed and bullets thickened, he knew the fight wouldn't end clean. One man bolted toward the stable. Matthew took aim and fired 1 shot. The figure crumpled into the snow. The others cursed, returning fire hard. 1 round shattered a lantern on the shelf, spilling oil across the floor. Nia lunged, smothering the spill with a blanket before flame could catch. Matthew's eyes flicked to her, breath catching. She wasn't a burden. She was fighting, same as him. The gunfire slowed. Then a voice rang out. You can't hold us forever, Cowboy. Hand her over and you live. Matthew's reply came low, solid as stone. She's not yours. You want her, you'll die trying. Silence fell. Then the crunch of boots in snow. They were circling. Matthew reloaded fast, sliding the revolver across the table to Nia. She met his gaze, took it without hesitation. I can shoot, she said. He nodded once. Watch the back. Don't waste a round. The next assault hit harder. 1 man charged from the front, firing wild. Matthew dropped to a knee, sighted, fired once. The man fell, snow bursting red around him. Another came from the far side. But before Matthew could turn, a shot cracked behind him. Nia stood at the rear shutter, revolver steady, eyes blazing. The man outside stumbled, clutching his arm, retreating into the trees. Matthew turned, breathless. For a moment they only stared. The broken man who'd vowed never to care and the woman who had brought life back into his silence. She hadn't cowered. She had fought beside him. Outside, the last man shouted something rough, then mounted and fled. The valley went still, save for Matthew's pounding heart and the hiss of wind across the eaves. He lowered the rifle slowly, shoulders sagging under the weight of what remained. Smoke drifted from the shattered lantern, hanging low in the room. Nia set the revolver down, chest rising fast. Matthew stepped close, his rough hand brushing her arm. She looked up, eyes sharp but softer now, filled with something fragile and new. "You stayed," he said quietly. "I told you I would," she answered, voice steady as steel. For the first time in 3 winters, Matthew felt the walls inside him give way. They were alive, not because he'd saved her, but because they'd stood together. As the fire rekindled and silence settled again, he knew one truth for certain: the men would return. Matthew knew that as surely as he knew the cold wouldn't spare him. The clearing outside had gone still again, but not with peace, only the uneasy quiet that follows violence. The blood in the snow, the broken lantern glass, the dark stains on the floor all whispered of what had been done and what couldn't be taken back. Matthew moved among the wreckage with the steady control of a man who had survived too much to tremble. But inside something heavy churned. He had sworn to leave killing behind, to live only by the rhythm of chores and silence. Yet the rifle in his grip reminded him of the life he had tried to bury and the man he still was beneath it. Outside, the cold bit deep. One body lay near the corral, already half covered by drifting snow. Another crawled weakly toward the trees, leaving a dark trail that marked his end. The third had escaped, and Matthew knew that meant more trouble. Men like that didn't forgive, they regrouped. His pale eyes scanned the ridge before turning back to the cabin, where Nia knelt near the fire, the revolver beside her. The flames painted her face in uneven light. Her hands moved with purpose, though her breath came fast, her body still caught between fear and defiance. When he entered, she looked up. "They'll come again," she said quietly. Matthew stripped off his gloves, voice low. "Yes." He sat, rubbing his rough hands over his face, feeling the weight of her eyes on him. "You stood your ground," he said at last. "You didn't have to." Her answer came sharp. "If I run every time, I stay prey." "I won't be prey." The words struck him like a confession. He thought of his wife's fever, his son's limp hand, and all the helpless nights that had hollowed him out. But this woman, this fighter, had changed something. She carried no helplessness, only will. That will made him want to live again. The cabin bore the scars of the fight. Bullet holes in the window frame, a splintered table leg, oil stains on the floor. By morning, Matthew worked to mend what he could. Nia helped, melting snow for water, sweeping ash, sealing the cracks against the wind. They didn't speak much, but their movements fell into rhythm. 2 survivors learning to share the same silence. Questions lingered unasked. Where she had come from, what she had lost, and why she had found her way to his door. That night, as the stew thinned and the fire dimmed, Matthew finally asked, "Was there no one left?" Nia stilled. The flames reflected in her eyes. "My father died when soldiers came. My mother to sickness. My brother, he was traded south. I am the last." Her voice didn't shake, but it hollowed the air. Matthew sat back, his chest tightening. He knew loss, but hers was stripped raw. Family gone, people scattered, hunted for profit. He reached across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. She hesitated, then left it there. The silence between them deepened, but it no longer felt empty. When she lifted her eyes, something new glimmered in them. Not fear, not pride, but quiet longing. That night, when they lay down, she moved close again, her hand finding his chest. Matthew's pulse quickened under her touch. For years, he had promised himself he'd never open that door again, but she was already inside. He leaned down, brushed her lips gently with his. The kiss was slow, unsure, built from all the things neither could say. When it ended, her forehead rested against his. "You didn't turn me out," she murmured. His voice rasped low. "And I won't." The silence after carried warmth instead of distance. By morning, his choice was carved in action. He dug a trench near the corral, reinforced the shutters, stocked wood by the door. Nia worked beside him, hauling snow, breaking branches, tending fire. No longer a guest, but a partner. As night fell, the cabin felt alive again. The marks of battle remained, but so did strength. Matthew watched her as she mended his torn sleeve, her hair falling forward, the firelight soft against her skin. Hope, a feeling long dead, stirred inside him. Yet he knew the danger still loomed. The men would come back. Still, when Nia looked up, meeting his gaze, he felt certain of one truth: they would face it together. The cabin no longer belonged to silence. Every corner carried her presence now. The folded shirt, the needle and thread, the blanket by the hearth. Once those details would have meant nothing. Now they meant life shared. Still, the threat remained. 3 men had come. 1 escaped. A survivor meant others would follow. Matthew cleaned the rifle again, his senses sharpened by dread. Outside, Nia stood by the corral in his coat, her dark hair loose in the wind. Her eyes searched the tree line. "You watch like someone hunted," he said softly. She turned, voice steady. "I am hunted, and so are you now because you chose to stand with me." Matthew looked past her across the frozen ridges and said nothing. He had lived 3 winters alone, convinced he'd stopped choosing. But this her proved he still could. But she was right. The choice had been made the moment he'd opened the door and let her in. Later that day, while they worked side by side splitting wood, Nia finally asked what had been sitting in her eyes for days. "Why do you live out here alone?" Matthew's hands froze on the axe handle. The memory rose unbidden. His wife's fever, his boy's small grave under frozen ground. His throat tightened. "I had a family," he said quietly. "I lost them. After that, I figured silence was safer than hope." Nia watched him for a long time, her dark eyes softer than he'd seen them. "Silence keeps you alive," she said, "but it doesn't keep you whole." The words cut through him like the wind outside. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She had known her own losses. Family gone, people scattered, and yet she still spoke as someone who had chosen to endure. In her, he saw the same fire he had buried long ago. That night, when they lay down, there was no hesitation left. When she leaned close, he wrapped his arm around her fully, his hand resting at her waist. She lifted her face to his, and he kissed her again. Deeper this time, years of silence breaking apart between them. For a long moment, they stayed there, breathing each other in as the fire painted light across their faces. When they parted, Nia rested her forehead on his chest, her voice quiet but sure. "You didn't turn me out. That makes you mine now, whether you want it or not." Matthew's laugh came rough, low, almost disbelieving. "Then I'm yours." Peace, however, didn't last. Before dawn, the horses screamed, sharp, terrified sounds that sliced through the cold. Matthew was up instantly, boots and coat on, rifle in hand. He stepped into the freezing dark, Nia close behind him. On the ridge above, shadowed against the pale snow, were more riders this time. 6, maybe 7, all armed. The sight hit hard. They had come back, and they had brought others. Nia's hand found his arm. "There are more." Matthew's jaw locked tight. The cabin wouldn't hold if they came hard. They would need more than wood and bullets. They would need will. He turned to her. "If it comes to it, we fight together. No running." "I already told you," she said, eyes fierce. "I stay." The riders didn't rush the cabin. They lingered on the ridge, waiting, watching, testing nerves. Matthew knew the tactic well. He led Nia back inside, barred the door, checked his rifle again, and handed her the revolver. Their eyes met in the lamplight. No words needed. The hours dragged heavy. Snow fell soft outside, swallowing every sound. Each creak of wood, each whisper of wind could have been the start of the fight. Nia sat across from him, revolver resting by her hand, gaze fixed and steady. Anyone hearing their story would wonder, was she afraid? Did she wish she'd never knocked on his door that night? But he saw no fear in her, only a quiet defiance, the look of someone who had already made her peace with what must be done. By nightfall, the men on the ridge crept closer. Through a narrow crack in the shutter, Matthew caught sight of them, shadows slipping through the trees, preparing. He turned from the window to her. "They'll come at dawn," he said. Her reply came steady, unflinching. "Then tomorrow we kill them." The fire burned low, the storm outside gone still, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt something beyond fear before a fight, something close to purpose. He wasn't standing alone anymore. Whatever waited with the dawn, they would meet it side by side. When the gray morning came, the sky heavy with new snow, Matthew Cole stood at the window crack, rifle steady in his hands. The figures moved along the tree line. 6 men at least, rifles slung, their horses stamping frost into the ground. They hadn't come to warn this time. They had come to finish. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Nia sat beside the stove, revolver resting in her lap. Her dark hair fell loose over the wool shirt he had given her, eyes sharp and ready. She didn't look afraid, she looked decided. And in that moment, Matthew understood something he hadn't said aloud. She had walked to his door not only to survive, but to choose, to fight, to live, and to stand with him. "They'll hit hard this time," Matthew said quietly. Nia's eyes lifted, fierce and calm. "Then we hit harder." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, full, steady, alive. The fire cracked softly, breaking the silence. Anyone hearing their story would wonder the same thing that haunted Matthew now. Was he willing to risk his home, his life, his future, for a woman he'd known only a handful of days? The answer settled in him as firm as the rifle in his grip. Yes, because since she'd come, the quiet of his world had been shattered, and he knew he could never return to it. The first shots came fast, slamming into the cabin wall and spraying splinters across the floor. Matthew dropped to one knee, returning fire through the shutter. A rider spun from his horse, collapsing into the snow. The others shouted, their voices sharp in the frozen air. Nia crawled to the rear shutter, revolver steady in her hands. When a shadow slipped between the trees, she fired. A cry echoed back, the man stumbling as his rifle fell from his grasp. Gunfire tore through the clearing. Wood split, smoke thickened, and the cabin filled with the bitter scent of powder. Matthew moved from one window to the next, firing measured shots, never wasting a round. Outside, the men cursed and shouted, trying to circle the place. He felt the familiar rhythm of battle, heart pounding, ears ringing, the world shrinking to sound and sight. But this time was different. He wasn't fighting to live. He was fighting for her. Two men broke toward the corral. Matthew yanked open the shutter and fired twice. One dropped, the other bolted for the trees. Return shots shattered the frame beside his head, close enough to burn his cheek. He ducked, reloading quick, hands moving from instinct honed long ago. Beside him, Nia rose from the floor, eyes blazing. She grabbed the cartridges off the table and thrust them toward him. "Don't stop," she said. "They'll break if you keep pressing." Her certainty struck him harder than the gunfire. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't hiding. She was fighting, his equal in resolve. He loaded, raised his rifle, and fired again. Another man fell. The shouts outside faltered. What had begun as an easy prize had turned into a reckoning. 3 dead, 1 wounded. A final volley tore into the cabin. Then silence followed, boots pounding through drifts, saddles creaking, men fleeing into the trees. Matthew kept his aim steady through the crack until the last shape disappeared. Then he lowered the rifle slowly. His chest rose and fell hard. His arms ached, but his eyes stayed sharp. When no sound came but the sigh of wind, he turned. Nia still held the revolver, though her shoulders eased at last. Their gazes met. For the first time since the shooting began, she let out a trembling breath. Matthew crossed the room and placed his hand over hers, gently lowering the gun to the table. For a long moment they just looked at each other, the quiet rancher who'd locked himself away, and the woman who had come to his door with nothing but defiance and need. "It's over," he said quietly. "They won't come again?" she asked, her voice thin with hope more than doubt. "They lost too many," he said. "Men like that don't die for a fight they can't win." He paused, jaw tight. "And if they try, they'll find us ready." Something in her softened. She stepped closer, her trembling hand brushing his chest. He exhaled, lowering his forehead to hers. The space between them filled with warmth no fire could match. "Then I stay," she whispered. "If you'll have me." His throat tightened. 3 winters he had lived in silence and grief. Now the choice came easily. "Stay," he said firmly. "This is your home now, same as mine." Her eyes glistened, and then she kissed him. There was no hesitation in it, only the weight of what they had endured. His arms wrapped around her, a silent promise that she would never face the cold alone again. Days passed. Snow still deep, scars of battle patched with rough wood and nailed shutters. Yet inside, everything had changed. The stove burned hotter. Meals were shared. The silence no longer empty, but filled with quiet understanding. Each morning, Matthew rose not for himself, but for her. Nia, once hunted and hollow, now moved with the calm of belonging. Months later, anyone passing the clearing would see only smoke curling from a chimney. A man tending his horses, a woman gathering water from melted snow, but inside the truth lived quietly. They had chosen to stay. And in staying, they had found what both believed lost forever, not just survival, but home. The story did not end with uncertainty, but with promise. Matthew Cole and Nia would face every winter together and never be alone again.